I've been playing outdoors since I was a kid, standing by the front door at around 2 years old, hollering, "Side, side," trying to get my mom to let me go play outside. Now, after 30 plus years working in the outdoor business, I'm dropping insider conversations every week with brand leaders, guides, marketers, CEOs, and others that make the outdoor business a trillion-dollar juggernaut that drives product innovation, revenue, and public policy for everything outdoors. I'm Rick Sayes. Welcome to the Outdoor Biz Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.
If you like chocolate, which honestly might be a red flag if you don't, you have to try out Ritual Chocolate. Ritual Chocolate is my favorite chocolate brand by far, and I learned about them from spending a lot of time in Park City, Utah, where they're based nearby, and actually got to take my family to a chocolate tasting at their factory. And it changed the way we all think about and eat small batch chocolate. While I already had loved the bars, it opened up my world to the variety and depth of flavor profiles chocolate can have. I'm so excited to be sharing this with you all. Who Runs This Park listeners get 10% off their online purchases of Ritual Chocolate. Go to ritualchocolate.com, that's RITUAL chocolate.com, and use promo code WRTP for 10% off. You'll be thanking me later for this, I promise. And did I mention I'm obsessed with their packaging? It's so beautiful, so even just having the bars and opening them up is a treat. Get on it and order some chocolate. Okay, let's get back to the show.
It was breathtaking, Maddie. It really was. It's hard to even describe how beautiful the park is and how big it is.
Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Today, we get to hear the story of Mark Dowdle, the Superintendent of Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. Mark himself has experienced the grandeur of America, working at parks across the country, including Yosemite, Yellowstone, Everglades, and Dry Tortugas, just to name a few. Having spent a summer in Alaska after college, coming back up to the last frontier is an honor for Mark as he manages not only the farthest north national park, but also the most remote and least visited of our national parks. Gates of the Arctic, a vast wilderness the size of Switzerland, contains no national park facilities, visitor centers, or campgrounds, and maintains the wild and undeveloped character of the area. I'm beyond excited to hear Mark's story and learn about one of the world's most remote parks. Mark, welcome to Who Runs This Park. It's a joy to have you today.
Hi, Maddie. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I, mentioned it in the intro, but I think one of the biggest things about Gates of the Arctic is the remoteness and the ruggedness. So I would love for everyone listening for you to set the scene of just how remote it is. And
maybe the best way to do this is do an exercise. This is a close your eyes and imagine exercise. So close your eyes and imagine a wilderness. Think big. Really big. Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve is over 8.4 million acres in size. That's over 13,000 square miles, and that's almost 4 times bigger than Yellowstone National Park. It's bigger than the state of Maryland. In fact, it's bigger than 9 of our individual U.S. states. And Maddie, I've never done the math before, but apparently it's the size of Switzerland. Now imagine a landscape that's north of the Arctic Circle, 100% north of the Arctic Circle. It has rugged mountains, which are in the Brooks Range, which are considered to be the northernmost extension of the Rocky Mountains. These are not the tallest mountains in Alaska, but they're still impressive. It has vast expanses of treeless tundra, glaciated valleys, boreal forest of white spruce, aspen, and birch trees, and sparse black spruce forest called taiga, and many rivers. Imagine a landscape that has what we would consider to be winter, or what most people would consider to be winter, for 7 or 8 months out of the year, with temperatures that can dip below minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine that the sun does not come up at all for a portion of the winter, but there's an extended twilight during the day. And then imagine the aurora borealis, what we call the northern light, dancing in the sky in green and red hues. Imagine that in the summer, the sun does not set during the month of June, and it's light for 24 hours. Imagine large herds of migrating caribou. Imagine moose, wolverines, wolves, Dall sheep, brown bears, and imagine wildflowers blooming in the short Arctic summer. And then imagine also millions of buzzing mosquitoes during the summer months. And then imagine the descendants of Alaska's first human inhabitants living their traditional lifestyles through subsistence distance hunting of animals and gathering plants and berries throughout the park, and imagine a place where there are no roads, no trails, no facilities, no services. Imagine the solitude and the sound of the wind and running water. It's really, Maddie, it's a truly natural wilderness. There are two other NPS units adjacent to Gates of the Arctic to the west of the park. One is called Noatak National Preserve, and the other is Kobuk Valley National Park, which are managed separately from Gates of the Arctic. But when you combine all of these lands together, it's one of the largest protected parkland areas in the entire world.
Yeah, the first part was making me chuckle because I was realizing I listen to podcasts a lot when I'm driving, and I was like, people better not be closing their eyes if they're driving. So for all those people who are listening right now, I hope you closed your eyes in a safe circumstance. But yeah, thank you for painting that picture. I mean, I'm struck by the Aurora Borealis. I'm thinking of, just the vastness and the open, sweeping valleys with mountains in the background. It's making me think of, I did this hike in the north of Sweden called the Kungsleden, and I believe there's a national park south of that in Sweden that is also one of the more remote parks. I don't know if you're familiar with it, actually.
I'm not.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called, but it's a similar situation where there's no pre-described trails. You might be following moose tracks as your trail, and you're doing a lot of wading through marshes and it's before learning about Gates of the Arctic. I had only heard of that in Sweden because of my experience hiking just north of it. And so it's been cool to be learning about this place within the US, within, above the Arctic Circle that is so remote and so rugged and is a place of solitude. So I think that probably leads itself a way that I kind of skipped around a little bit, but a way I usually start interviews is by asking the most unique situation you've had working as superintendent of your park. But I thought setting the stage of the type of park that you're managing was important for folks.
Yes.
I guess what is one of the more unique experiences you've had as superintendent of Gates of the Arctic?
Yeah, well, this may not be completely unique, but for me, it was fun and inspiring, and I think one of the best things ever that a superintendent can do. So several weeks ago, Interior Alaska held its annual science fair for elementary school students.
Cool.
There were over 500 students that participated. There were 350 projects, and it was very impressive and very amazing. And one of our park biologists got invited to be one of the judges for the science fair competition, and I got to, along with our biologist, got to present the award. So the National Park Service selected
cool.
3 projects that we presented awards to these amazing young scientists, and I tell you, Maddie, it's just so inspiring. I keep thinking about it every day because, you can read the news and what's going on in the world and come away not so hopeful, but to see these young scientists and the projects that they created, their ingenuity, their imagination, what they've created gives me a lot of hope, and that there is a next generation of park stewards and advocates that will one day, hopefully one of them will be doing my job. That's really cool.
And who was it hosted by? It was hosted by the Interior of Alaska?
Yeah, so all of the, Alaska's a really big state geographically, but it's population-wise, it's not so big. And so the northern Alaska, they've really just kind of pulled together, all of the schools, particularly in the Fairbanks area.
Any specific projects that really stand out to you?
Yeah, well, one of them was called Awesome Otters. That was the title of the project, and it was about
Love it.
Otters in the environment, how they live and what they do.
Awesome Otters. Yeah, I like it. My understanding is that you're assigned, or your desk is in Fairbanks, correct?
That's correct.
Can you give folks some context of how far Fairbanks is from Gates of the Arctic?
Yeah.
And maybe, I was curious, how often do you go into the park? How do you get to the park? Stuff like that.
That's a great question. So Fairbanks is about 200 miles south of Gates of the Arctic, the actual park. That's a long way. In all of my prior experiences, I've always been duty stationed, or my office or my ranger station was in the park itself, and I could see the park. I could walk outside and usually even in most places interact with park visitors and help answer their questions and that kind of thing. And, this is a little bit different experience because the park headquarters is quite a distance from the park. And it's because of what we've talked about already, that the park is so remote. We don't have facilities and roads to get there and inside of the park. So it does create some challenges sometimes because, just that distance, and I'm not in the park the way that I am used to being in the park. So managing from a distance feels a little different, but it's neat to know that there is a place that is so big and wild that we don't even have an office there. We do have some park facilities just on the outside or the perimeter of the park. We have a couple of visitor centers, one in a village called Bettles to the south of the park. And then we're a partner along with the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Arctic Interagency Visitor Center, which is located in Colfoot, Alaska, just to the east of the park.
Oh, interesting. How often do you go into the park? And are you taking a plane typically?
Always taking a plane to get there. I
Okay.
tend to be flying over the park more than actually being in it. It is a goal of mine to spend more time there but it takes a lot of time to be able to do that.
And coordination probably to be prepared and have the right resources and the right folks with you in the group who have the experience to be in that wild of a environment. That's, probably a few days from help.
Yeah, and the right weather. For sure, especially when you're flying in northern Alaska.
I mean, I feel like I've learned when I was talking to the Lake Clark superintendent, weather was a huge factor there of, you kind of have to go into the backcountry with the expectation of have more food than the days you plan to be in the backcountry because you might, per weather, not be able to be picked up for like a couple days, which is wild.
Yes, it's definitely something that needs to be factored in. And I think another thing, Maddie, is that when people are hiking and going on, whether it's a several day trek or a month or whatever that is, people are often used to hiking in parks that have trails. People think, gosh, I can hike 10 miles a day or 20 miles a day. And so I can cover, this 100-mile distance that I want to do on my trek, and I can do it in just several days. And it's not like that in Gates of the Arctic. There are no trails, and walking through the tundra or the taiga it's different, and there's a lot of up and down. If you're doing that in the summer, there's going to be streams to cross, and it's sort of just adjusting that expectation that I may only cover 3 or 4 or maybe 5 miles if I'm lucky. 15 or 20 miles that I know that I've covered in other places.
Yeah, I remember my friend and I were in Glacier National Park last summer, and we were doing maybe a 10-mile hike. It was just a day hike. It wasn't anything, that's significant, but it wasn't crazy. And we met this couple who was backpacking, and they were like, yeah, we got 18 miles today. And they had this huge bag on their back. And we were like, what? You have 18? We were like, we thought 10 was like decent.
Yeah, that's impressive.
But it is a good reminder to think when you're in that rugged of a terrain like Gates of the Arctic, the amount of energy expended to just even locate the path to bushwhack paths or find an area that you can walk through probably adds time and energy to your
sometimes
journey.
It's not just the terrain, but it's it's what you're walking on. If you're walking on tundra, it might be really mushy or wet, very uneven, very soft, or just a lot of brush. And then you have to always factor in traveling in bear country and having an awareness there too.
Are there polar bears, or is it not polar bear country?
Yeah, polar bears tend to live along the coast. They have been known to come inland some, but I would be very shocked if one were found in Gates of the Arctic, because we are more inland. But if you traveled a few hundred miles north up to the Bering Sea, to the west, to the Chukchi Sea, you may find some polar bears there.
Okay, interesting. Before we dive deeper into Gates of the Arctic, I'd love to hear and kind of understand why you were inspired to end up where you are today. How'd you get into the Park Service, stuff like that? And I'm curious did you have experiences in nature as a kid that you feel like directed you to work for the Park Service?
Yeah, I was talking about the young scientists from the science fair, and I think that's a good example. And even my own example, which I'll share with you, is the importance of these experiences in youth and how we learn to be comfortable in the outdoors and what that means to us later in life. And I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, and it was small enough. I would walk to my elementary school, even as a kid. And gosh, sometimes my pet dog would show up on the steps of the school after school and just be there. And being a small town, we lived on, I guess you'd kind of call it the edge of town, if you will.
Yeah.
And there were lots of woods and lots of places for me to spend outdoors. And I think I was really fortunate. This was the days before the internet and video games, and we had a television, but even the tube on that blew out at one point, and my parents said, well, we're just not going to fix it. And we went for a few years without television. I thought that was great.
Yeah, you're like, oh, good. It's like parents not letting their kids go on technology or something today. You're like, maybe that's a good thing for a little bit.
Yeah.
But as a kid, you're like, no, I want to watch TV.
Well, I'm sure I was that way some as well, because my friends at school would talk about the shows that they saw on television, and I had no idea what they were talking about. So I felt a little bit left out in that regards. But I did spend my time outside, and that's my memory of my childhood, running through the woods. There was this large river bottomland nearby as well. It was used for agricultural purposes, so lots of corn was grown there and other things, and it seemed to me a really big world to go back there now. It seems really small, or to go to a place like Roots of the Arctic, it seems really small. But that was my world, and my brothers and my sister and our friends, we built forts and out of or little teepees out of sticks. We had trails through the woods. I think really my only guidance was, Mark, stay out of the poison oak and don't be near the railroad track when the train is going by. Those were kind of my curbs and everything else.
Your two rules, yeah.
And then later had the opportunity to join the Boy Scouts in our small town. We didn't work too much on our merit badges, but we did spend a lot of time going camping and canoeing. So I think...
You're like, we're going to do the fun camping things more.
We did all of the same stuff. We just didn't necessarily get the credit for it, I guess.
Right.
And then my dad and some of his friends would go on these extended weekend backpacking trips to a place called Limble Gorge Wilderness up in the mountains of North Carolina. I think I was 12. I was finally old enough to carry my own pack and get to go on these trips. It was just a fantastic experience to carry your own backpack, to walk down into this designated wilderness gorge and have to cross the river at the bottom of it. And it was just really exciting. And it really did help my understanding of being outdoors and my appreciation of it. And I think also in childhood, my time going fishing and hunting with my dad, I think it was a big part of that too.
You're making me think of the first time I backpacked. It wasn't until I was in college, but I went backpacking in Big Bend through our outdoor program at school. And it was a similar thing I was like, there's something about carrying all your stuff. And I tell friends all the time, my favorite thing about it is usually that you don't have cell service. And so you're just in my case, it was with a random group of people, but it would be the same if you're with close friends. But you just, in such a short time frame, because there's no distractions and you're having to work as a team together because you're having to make decisions and see how the group is feeling activity wise, helping people set up tents, helping everyone prepare dinner and clean up and everything. Like, it's just such a communal thing.
Yeah.
I was so struck by it. So it's fun to hear about your first experience I guess it was and you said it was still in North Carolina?
That was, yes.
Cool. So then did that impact what you studied in school or where you went to school, or was it more just something that you enjoyed?
Yeah, well, it was definitely something I enjoyed. And Maddie, I came from a family of engineers. So when I went off to college, that was my track. I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. And part of my schooling, I entered a program. It was a cooperative education program where I would work for a semester and then go to school for a semester, work for a semester, go to school for a semester. And it was a way of gaining some on-the-job experience relevant to a field of study. And I was working in a textile company, and which was really big in North Carolina, textile manufacturing in North Carolina back then. And I was almost like a junior engineer doing these. They were like time motion studies where you would study people interacting with machinery, try to find ways to make it safer or more efficient.
Oh, interesting.
And it was really interesting, and I worked with some phenomenal people. But I think the other thing that came out of that experience is I realized that was not the environment that I wanted to be in for all of my life. So I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had identified something that maybe I didn't want to do. So I went back to school. I was definitely committed to finishing finishing college. And then the day after I graduated from college, I had a 1970 Plymouth Satellite car. That was my car, and it had the biggest trunk that you could ever that you've ever seen. It was huge.
Yeah.
And I packed what I owned into that car the day after graduation, and I drove to Yellowstone National Park. And I got a job there. I got paid $4.10 an hour to stack boxes in a warehouse for a concessionaire, a company that, provided all of the services in the park.
Right.
And, I still didn't know what I wanted to do with my life as far as work, but I found a place that I felt like I had found the place where I was supposed to be. So I did that for several years. In the winter months, I would drive over the snow, we called it a snow coach, and we would bring people in and out of the park, sometimes for overnight trips or just tours. And on those tours, I would provide a narrative in a tour, or what I thought was one. And it really helped me learn to interact with people and to start understand what the resources of the park were and what some of the management issues were. It was really, for me, a foundational experience for what I do now. And then I had some friends that had spent a summer in Alaska, and I didn't know much about it. We didn't even have the internet, so it's not like I could look it up. But I was like, I want to do that. So without a plan,
you're like,
without
sounds
a job,
cool.
I know. I had no plan. I had no job. I packed my backpack. I caught a ride with a friend from Yellowstone to Seattle. I got on an airplane, flew to Anchorage, started an entire summer journey of exploring Alaska. At the end of the summer, gosh, I loved it. I really did want to stay. I had some friends that's like, Mark, you got to stay. I said, well, I do like that, but I like to ski, and my skis are down in Yellowstone, and I do have a job there for the winter. So that was my deciding factor to leave Alaska.
That's funny.
My first experience in Alaska. So I wanted to be where my skis were, and after a summer of not doing a lot of work, I needed a job.
Okay, so your summer in Alaska was more so just exploring rather than working for a particular park.
Yes, I mostly explored. I came a time where I needed to work some, and I got a job. It was really trading labor for a place to live. I worked for a person that had just won the previous winter the Iditarod sled dog race, and I helped him take care of his dogs, his sled dogs. And it's in the summer months, so there wasn't too much to do. But he provided me a cabin. It was what we call a dry cabin. That means it has no running water and no electricity. And I had to haul my water up from a creek. And it was great. I loved it. It was just one of the most wonderful homes I've ever had.
Wow.
Yeah.
When I was in Glacier again, on our hike, we went to one of the lodges that's like tucked in the mountain. And the folks that work at the lodge have to go and get water every morning because it is, I guess, a dry cabin, technically.
Yeah.
So like if you're paying to stay there, they have water for you. But it's like there's a lot of effort that goes in.
It's a lot of work.
That.
Yeah, on a day-to-day basis.
Water's heavy, It's like even on small backpacking trips that I've been on, when you have to filter your water, you just have to account for it in time of like going to the creek and getting your water filter out and filling up your water and making sure you have enough. We take running water for granted. It's nice. It gives you new perspective when you come back. You're like, wow, it's so nice to have a hot shower. Like, what a privilege.
Yeah, and when you don't have a tap, a sink to just turn the water on, and you have to go and haul it each day, it is a different perspective.
So then I know one of the earlier positions you had was working in the Old Faithful Backcountry office, which was in Yellowstone.
Yeah.
Could you share what that is? I was curious when I was researching. I was like, ooh, the Old Faithful Backcountry office.
Yeah.
Sounds fancy.
First, I was telling you that I was working for the park concessionaire, and I had progressed a little bit, and I got this wonderful job just before I started working for the Park Service. It was called the Historic Preservation Crew, and we did maintenance work on historic structures in Yellowstone. We were working on the Old Faithful Run. It was a great job, really was. But I think earlier that spring, I had applied to a seasonal job with the National Park Service, and I never heard anything back. Hiring in the government's a little different, and maybe I just didn't make the list or whatever it was. But I never heard back from that. And then one day, it was probably in early August of that summer, a ranger who I knew, and I'd done some volunteer search and rescue in the winter months for the National Park Service. A ranger walked up to me and said, "Hey, Mark, can I speak with you for a moment?" And of course, my first thought was, oh my goodness, the ranger's here. What did I do? And he said, "Mark, would you like to come work for us?" we have an opening in our backcountry office here at Old Faithful. And I said yes. And 2 weeks later, there I was, my very first National Park Service job. And the
That's
office,
cool.
so call it a backcountry office, but it's a place where people who are going to go out into camping in the backcountry or hiking, if you're staying overnight, you needed to get a permit. Back then, it was a free permit, and we provided orientation on how to best pack your food and keep it safe from bears, and how to keep a clean camp and put out your campfire and all of those kinds of things. And then I also got to work on the trails and the backcountry campsites as well. So it was a great first job, but it only lasted a couple of months, and then summer.
Oh, because it was a
Summer
seasonal
over.
position.
Yes. So that summer or that fall, I went to what we call a seasonal law enforcement ranger academy. Paid for that out of my own pocket, the tuition. I did that in the mountains of North Carolina. These are generally, there's a
Was
number
that
of
the
them.
FBI Academy?
No, this was before that. These
Okay.
are academies. There are, probably 8 or even 10 of them throughout the country, generally tied to universities or colleges. And it's a program where if you go there, when you graduate, you meet the eligibility requirements to get a seasonal National Park Service law enforcement ranger job.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I did that. And then the very next summer, I got that job at Old Faithful again.
Okay.
But this time I was
nice.
a law enforcement park ranger. I did that for a couple of seasons at Old Faithful. In the summer, I worked a season at Chiricahua National Monument in southeast Arizona. It's down near the border with Mexico. And I did a season in Big Cypress National Preserve in South Florida. And the job in South Florida, it was in the winter months. And I'm like, I don't know anything about it. It's winter, and I like to ski, and there's no snow in South Florida. And I say I went kicking and screaming to take that job, but there just weren't a lot of seasonal ranger jobs in the winter back then. And so I said I went kicking and screaming, but I absolutely loved it. I worked with fantastic people, and it was just so beautiful. It really opened my eyes, Maddie, to what it's like to work in other national parks. Because I've been in Yellowstone for a while, and I thought that was my forever place. I can still consider it one of my homes. It showed me what else is out there for opportunities.
Yeah, and I'm sure the extra sunshine in the summer. I love skiing also, but I grew up in Austin, and so I'm a little spoiled, and I'm like, well, I do love skiing, but it's nice to not be cold in the winter.
Yeah, no, it was great.
You've mentioned that you're a big skier. Do you get to ski much in Alaska, in Fairbanks area?
Yeah, I try. There's a lot of trails. It's really a wonderful place to do that. There's a lot of groom trails. There's a lot of ski races and that kind of thing. I don't do that kind of skiing. I'm just a recreational skier. I'm happy when I'm just skiing through the trees, and a little bit of downhill too. And yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity. One of the challenges in northern Alaska, in Fairbanks, it's pretty cold in the winter, and like the core winter months, and sometimes it just feels like, if it's kind of my cutoff is minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, I'll go ski then, but it's not as comfortable. So I may tend to wait for it to warm up just a little bit.
So more like March and April are ski months,
Well, even in the core winter months, you can get periods where it may warm up to, above zero, or just between 0 and minus 20, which is,
oh my gosh.
Bad. And it's all relative. Temperature is relative. After you've experienced some minus 30 and 40 or minus 45, and it warms up to minus 20 or minus 5. It's not so bad.
You're like, oh, it's nice out. I mean, I did a backcountry ski trip in Japan, and it was like 5 degrees when we were there, which, again, coming from Austin is cold. But it was so crazy because you would be sweating buckets because you're like climbing the mountain. And so the whole thing is sweat management, essentially, because what you don't want is to like sweat too much through your clothes and be too hot when you're hiking and then stop exercising and get really cold and all your clothes are wet. And so it's this interesting, you'd be hiking with very few layers on, 1 or 2 layers on, and then you stop and immediately, to take a break, you immediately put all your layers on and shove your face with food and then, put your gloves on or trying to stay warm. And then the minute you start hiking again, you like slowly take everything back off. So it's a very interesting pattern.
Yeah, sometimes skiing in the winter, I might be on my feet all day long, because if you sit down to take a break, your toes will start to get cold. So it's just kind of the idea of keeping moving as much as you can to stay warm.
So are you doing cross-country skiing mostly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds nice. Moving to, well, there's a couple areas we could go. But I guess one thing I do want to ask is about the FBI Academy, just because I was curious. When I was researching, I was like, ooh, what is that?
Yeah.
And then we can dive into more of the like Gates of the Arctic specific experiences and kind of some of the things that you're dealing with right now.
Yeah, it's actually called the FBI National Academy. So it's different than
Oh,
people who are hired to work in the FBI and they go to their academy to learn their job. The National
right.
Academy is a great program. It consists of people who work in the law enforcement field. They might be a sheriff of a county in Oregon, or they may be the chief of police for a major metropolitan city. Or in my case, I was chief ranger of Boston National Historical Park in Boston,
Mm,
Massachusetts at the time. So the federal government does get a few slots in this academy each year, and I had the opportunity to apply for it, got accepted. I was really excited, and really what it is, it's like a graduate level college courses that you take there at the academy, but it's mixed in with other things like physical fitness and things like that, or just leadership development.
mm,
I think it was 12 weeks long. It's in Quantico, Virginia, where the FBI Academy is, and
right.
it was a great experience. I was real honored to be able to go and made some great friends there.
That's cool. How long of a program is it?
I think it was about 12 weeks
Okay.
in length.
That's cool. Okay, well, jumping into Gates of the Arctic, how did that opportunity present itself? And was it a hard decision to, I mean, because, moving from, were you in Boston previously?
Before Alaska, I went from Boston to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So Cape Hatteras
Oh,
National
yes.
Seashore, Fort
Yes.
Raleigh National Historic Site, Wright Brothers National Memorial. I was deputy superintendent for those three parks before I came to Alaska.
Okay. Yeah. How was that decision to move very far?
Well, it was a big change, that's for sure. I told you about my summer in Alaska a long time ago. I had always wanted to come back. To
Right.
live and work in Alaska and do it, do it right, move here and be here year round. And I got the opportunity to fill in as the superintendent, or we'd call the acting superintendent, for the Western Arctic National Park land. So I mentioned earlier Noatak National Preserve and Kobuk
Hmm.
Valley National Park, and then there's also Cape Krusenstern National Monument, which are on the far west side of Alaska, and the headquarters there is in Kotzebue, Alaska. It's north of the Arctic Circle. It's along the Chukchi Sea, and it's
Hmm.
just this a village, a native Alaska village of about 3,000 people, and the park
Wow.
headquarters is there. And I got to spend a winter there. My first experience back in Alaska in the winter, north of the Arctic Circle, there 3 winters ago, and it was a great experience, and it was enough to get me hooked to want to stay here. So the job for Gates of the Arctic and Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve came up, and I applied for it, and I got the job. I
Here
think,
we are.
Maddie, yesterday was my 2-year anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. You've had 2 winters, I guess, right?
Yes. Yep. Well, three
Two
counting
winters and two
that
summers.
first winter, but this is
Well,
the
true.
end of my second winter at Gates of the Arctic.
Okay. Wow. And I guess with Gates of the Arctic, what has been thus far your most memorable experience in the park?
Yeah, well, I think, Maddie, last summer I had the opportunity to show my boss, who works down in Anchorage. I got an opportunity to show him the park, and he was fairly
Wow.
new to Alaska as well. So it was great to host him, and I wanted him to really understand like how big this park is and what our issues
Hmm.
are and what it's like to work here. So we spent about a week, spent several days over in Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, because I'm the superintendent for that park area as well, and that's in western Alaska. You'll have to do another episode on that one. But then we went to Gates of the Arctic, and we were flying up to the north end of the park. To a place called Anatuvik Pass. It's a native village. We have a
Oh,
ranger
yes.
station there, and we were going to go spend the night there. And we flew through what's called the Gate of the Arctic. So back in the late 1920s, Bob Marshall, who's known for his wilderness advocacy, and there's a designated wilderness area in Montana named after him, the Bob Marshall Wilderness.
Wow.
That when he was on a trip to what's now Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, he got to a spot where there was this two mountains, one on each side. He was down in the valley. One mountain was called Frigid Crags, and the other is called Boreal Mountain. And as you pass through there, he said this is like the gates of the Arctic. That when you pass through here from the south to the north, you enter the true Arctic environment. You really
Mm,
kind of get to the north side of the Brooks
right.
Range, and eventually this wide expanse of Arctic tundra opens up and goes all the way up to the sea. And we were flying through there in our park airplane. It was an absolutely beautiful day. It was late June, so there was, the verdant green, and on the lower parts of the mountains was showing there was still snow on the tops. And it was just like the perfect conditions to do that. So
Yeah.
I told my boss, "You're really lucky. This is a nice day. We're not,
Yeah.
it's not full of clouds, and we're actually going to make it through, and we're going to make it to Anatuvic Pass." And to me, that was a really memorable experience.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's cool that your boss got to see. Your hope for the trip was that they saw the beauty and vastness of the park, and the weather allowed for them to see that.
Yes,
so that's very cool. What is, I guess you've been there almost 2 years, or 2 years as of yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what now, 2 years in, what is top of mind for you at Gates of Arctic, and what are some of the biggest challenges you face?
I think a couple of things, Maddie. One thing that I think about a lot is Gates of the Arctic is part of the overall Arctic ecosystem. It's kind of right in the middle of it, but really how fragile this whole ecosystem is. It's a frozen environment, but climate is warming. I mean, it has been since the end of the last ice age, and there have been periods of time where it was much, much warmer, and there were forests, giant trees growing where Gates of the Arctic is, and other periods where it was very, very cold and glaciers were present and all of that. Well, we're in a period of warming now, and perhaps even accelerated warming, and the Arctic ecosystem is fragile, and small changes can have big impacts on that. So, for example, underlying a lot of the topsoil in Arctic Alaska is permafrost, which is really permanently frozen soil. And there's a lot of water locked up in that soil. So when that starts to warm, or maybe it's not frozen for as long during the year, or it's not, the permafrost is melting closer to the surface, then you can start to see the ground start to sink. You might see a lake or a pond develop where there wasn't one before through that sinking, and then the ice that's underneath there melting. And then also there's a lot of metals and minerals that are locked up in these permanently frozen soils. So if that starts to melt, some of those minerals and metals can start to leach up to the surface of the ground and get into streams. We call this the rusting of streams because it gives like a rusty or a reddish color. Yeah, and somewhat of a new phenomenon, at least for us in these days, and we're not sure what all the impacts of that will be. What will be the impacts to wildlife? Will be the impacts to water quality downstream, and how will this get worse? Will it become more prevalent? We're doing a lot of research on it now. We don't, so there's still a lot to learn from it.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that. That's what I've heard the term permafrost, but I didn't know it was like a layer of soil that's usually permanently frozen. Yeah. So that's interesting. That
it can be really, really deep too, and it can vary. I mean, even around Fairbanks, there are areas of permafrost, and if you build your house on top of permafrost, you have to do it the right way. Otherwise, the ground, it may melt or thaw some just because your house is on it, and your house may start to sag or sink. You don't want that.
Whoa!
So you have to do it the right way.
No. It's making me think of like an interesting effect of some climate change in the Grand Canyon is they're experiencing a period of aridity, which means my understanding is as it's getting hotter, the soil is absorbing more water. So even on years where I think they got a ton of snow 2 years ago or 1 year ago, more than they would typically need, but the absorption rate was so high that the amount of water that they kept wasn't nearly enough. And it was something of 90% water level or snow, and then like 30% water in the system or something like that to just show how much of it was being absorbed. And yeah, it's very humbling for sure.
Another thing, Maddie, that I think a lot about is how can we become better stewards of these lands, and how can we incorporate the traditional native Alaska knowledge? We often call this traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. And how can we really co-steward these lands, co-meaning together, and stewardship taken care of? How can we take care of these lands together, and what opportunities are there? Because there is a lot of knowledge, hundreds of years of traditional knowledge that has been passed down through traditional cultures, and it really takes those of us like myself from Western society to try to think in a different way and try to listen in a way that I have never listened for. and to look for those opportunities to be co-stewards. And that's something that's on my mind a lot in working with Native Alaska tribes and villages and nonprofits.
In what ways that was one of my questions, was kind of learning more about the ways that Gates of the Arctic interacts with Alaskan Native villages, and in what ways have you learned that they typically subsist from the land?
And maybe it takes just a little bit of context because you go back, many, even thousands of years, and Native Alaska peoples were somewhat nomadic. They would follow food sources. They might use a lot of areas like Gates of the Arctic seasonally where food sources were there and still do that, even though most people live in villages now. Often these are very remote villages. There are no roads to these places. You have to fly in and out, or perhaps they're along rivers. But they still use their traditional practices to hunt caribou and moose, sheep, collect berries, collect plants, and use all these different parts of animals and plants to subsist, to live their traditional lifestyles.
Yeah. One thing that I'm thinking of is, my understanding is that there's a mining road proposal, and that can threaten to disrupt both caribou migrations and native subsistence activities. So I was curious kind of on how the park is approaching that and thinking of that. And I actually listened to a podcast that talked a little bit about the proposal, and it sounds like across the board feelings are mixed because there's pros and cons with everything. But yeah, I'd love to hear the park's perspective.
Yeah, well, people are definitely very passionate about this subject and passionate about Alaska, passionate about what Alaska is all about. And I think, maybe a little context on this one too, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, please.
The Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve was created in 1980 by Congress by an act called the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, or ANILCA.
Okay.
And going back even well before the park was established, it was well understood that northern Alaska was rich in natural resources. So a lot of people are familiar with the enormous oil and gas reserves on the north slope of Alaska. And people have likely heard of the gold rush days of the late 1800s in Alaska. And there have been many gold rushes throughout Alaska. Even Fairbanks was established as a gold rush town. And that modern mining extraction of natural resources such as gold and copper, zinc, lead, that still happens. And there is a large area that there's interest for future exploration and development of mining these minerals. It's called the Ambler Mining District. It's just west. It's not in Gates of the Arctic, but it's west or southwest of the park. And there is a proposal to be able to explore or mine from there, to build an industrial access road it would be about 200 miles long, east to west. It would tie in with the what's called the Dalton Highway, or the Hall Road that parallels the Trans-Alaska Pipeline going north and south, and then would run west all the way to the Ambler Mining District. And part of the proposal, about 26 of that 200-mile route would go through Gates of the Arctic National Preserve. And I think probably important context too, because when the park was created, Congress actually said, and I'll read it to you, it's very short. Congress finds that there is a need for access for surface transportation purposes across the western or Kobuk River unit of Gates of the Arctic National Preserve from the Ambler Mining District to the Alaska Pipeline Hall Road, and the Secretary, that means the Secretary of the Interior, shall permit such access. So even when the park was created, that there was this thinking that this road may someday be proposed or may go in, and that Congress even allowed for that to happen through the preserve portion of the park. This is not the core national park portion of Gates of the Arctic, and it's not in the designated wilderness area, but it's just south of it. And I think really a main point, whether people are for or against the road, as it's referred to, that if the road were to be built, that it would change this part of Alaska forever. Not debating the good or the bad. It would change northern Alaska, and it does have impacts, and we do have studies that show that it can impact or impede the migration of caribou, for example. We put tracking collars on some caribou, and we can track them, satellites data, like where they are at this very moment, or where they've moved over the last weeks, and sometimes this data, not in not in every case, because caribou do cross the road sometimes, but there's a lot of examples where the caribou get to one of the existing roads and then they just turn around and go back the way that they came. It's almost like a
Oh,
fence or
interesting.
this barrier that they perceive is not natural, and they're afraid of
Yeah.
it, and they turn
Yeah.
often and go the other way.
Who would be the deciding factors of this road proposal? Like, what needs to get approved
Yeah.
for it to then be a reality?
Well, it's complicated, to say the least.
Yeah,
It's
of
ongoing,
course.
it's divisive, even among communities. And there are several lawsuits pending that exist about it. But the Department of the Interior designated the Bureau of Land Management as the lead federal agency for the evaluation, the environmental analysis and evaluation of this proposal, and whether it should be permitted a lot or not. And that process was done. There was even a decision made back around 2020. There were several lawsuits. The Department of the Interior went to the court and said, hey, we want to take back our decision and relook at it. So the Bureau of Land Management is the lead agency, and we participate in this effort with them, is relooking at the analysis and the impacts and the alternatives. And so no decision has been made yet. So that's still out there to be determined.
Because you had mentioned putting tracking devices on some of the caribou, and you kind of mentioned with the permafrost melting, some minerals and metals, I believe, in the permafrost that could be released into the land. Is that the work that you are doing to try and understand the impact of iron and mercury in Arctic streams, or is that a different study?
No, I think we're talking about the same thing. This is not necessarily related to the road proposal. This is different. This is something that we're seeing even inside of the park, where through a warming climate and the melting of permafrost, and that these kind of metals and minerals that are locked up in that permanently frozen soil are now leaching or mobilizing, as we call it, to the surface. And we're seeing some of that in some streams. Not all of them, but there are examples of streams that when you look at them, they are orange in color because there's so much concentrate of those substances in there.
And is the idea that you're evaluating how it affects the different species that are in those streams and rivers?
Yes. So, how much of this is happening? What's the potential for more to happen when this flows into the water and then flows into larger bodies of water? What are the impacts to water quality, and then what are the impacts of that to even humans or wildlife farther downstream.
Okay. What are some other studies that I guess the park is doing or partners are doing within Gates of Arctic?
Yeah. Well, we do a lot of counting of animals, particularly moose and caribou and sheep and wolves. And we do this, one, because it's tied closely into those subsistence activities that we talked about. And it's important to know those numbers to be able to inform our decision making related to whether certain areas. Now, Gates of the Arctic National Park is not open to general hunting. It is open to subsistence hunting by those people that live close to the park. They live in what we call resident zone communities. But the preserve sections are open to general hunting. And then there are lots of lands that surround the park, other federal lands, state lands, tribal lands, and, there may be different rules for hunting. And by understanding how healthy the populations of wildlife are, we can help set some of the hunting rules, if you will, so that we can definitely conserve these wildlife species. And if their numbers get too low, we get in more of a conservation mode. And if they're are more plentiful, then maybe there are more opportunities for general hunting as well. So it's really important to know what these numbers are doing because so many people depend on it.
Right. Another question, and this was more, I meant to ask this earlier, but I am curious about it. Given the remoteness of Gates of the Arctic, what is the park staff look like? Like, how is it structured? How is the park equipped for search and rescue, stuff like that?
Well, I mentioned some of the remote outposts that we have. We call them remote sites, Coalfoot and Bettles and Anatuvic Pass. And we do have some staff there, primarily more so in the summer, but we do have a few that live there year round. But it's really just a small portion of our staff. A lot of our management or administrative or even resource staff work and live out of Fairbanks, because sometimes we just need the internet and that kind of thing to be able to do our work. And then we go to the park to do the work and then come back and process that data
Right.
and that kind of thing back at headquarters. And then most of our traditional National Park Service visitation, those that are coming for recreational purposes are coming more in the summer months. And so our visitor centers in Bettles and Colfoot and our ranger station in Anatovik Pass are just open seasonally. But there
Okay.
is a trend for more people to come visit in the winter and to come
Really?
see the northern
And
lights. It's becoming a huge tourist attraction, and there
are they camping?
most people they're not staying inside the park. Most of them are on commercial tours, small commercial
Okay.
tours, and guides that take them up and maybe have some lodging facilities for them outside the park, or maybe they're doing
Okay.
overflights, or they're staying in places that are close to the park, but not necessarily inside. And of course, in the winter, it's dark for most or all of the day, so it's great for viewing the northern lights and just experiencing the Arctic ecosystem, going on sled dog rides or snowshoe walks. And
Yeah, it's funny because I have some backpacking experience, but there's no way with my level of knowledge right now that I could go to Gates of the Arctic by myself. Like it's not even I even am I've been thinking this whole time. I'm like, I wonder what I would need to do to feel confident to like get to that level. And that's a whole nother level because that's like map reading. That's, I can follow trails and read the pre-described maps that the Park Service gives, but reading like a topographical map, I'm not there.
well, we can help with some of that. Maybe not so much the map reading, but we do have in Fairbanks, we have what we call the Fairbanks, Alaska Public Lands Information Center. It's a visitor center in town, and it's to help people get information if they want to visit Gates of the Arctic or Yukon-Charlie rivers or any federal lands or other national park sites in Alaska. They're happy to help answer those questions. And they do a lot of orientation and sharing information for people that are interested, that have either planned a trip into Gates of the Arctic or think that they might want to plan a trip into Gates of the Arctic. So they can get a lot of information there. It really is helpful to talk to someone who knows about it and who's been there and done it. And
Yeah.
because it does, just like you said, Maddie, it takes a lot of preparation.
Yeah.
And when you're out there, you're on your own, so you have to take care of yourself.
Yeah. How is the park equipped for search and rescue missions, if at all? Is it through the Park Service or is it through like a different arm?
Well, it's kind of everyone pitches in kind of environment.
Right.
Nobody has a lot of resources. We have several airplanes. We might be able to go search for someone, but we might not be able to land to pick them up. So sometimes we'll work with the state of Alaska, even the military sometimes to help with search and rescue. But we're fortunate. I think we've done a good job, and the people that come visit have done a good job. So that has been those have been more rare occasions.
Yeah. It's funny because before preparing for this, it's kind of like that psychological thing where then I started seeing Gates of the Arctic everywhere. So any podcast that was covering it, I would listen to it in preparation. And another one was about this father and son that were on a camping trip. And had to get, or like a rafting trip and had to get rescued. And it was such a miracle that they were found, and that it just gave a lot of context into, like you said, sometimes they could be spotted, but they can't land for a couple of days. And I think they had to drop down food and water to the spot, and that helped them subsist and survive for a few more days until they were able to like come back and land and pick them up.
Yeah, that's often the way that it works because the weather may prohibit people from even looking or finding someone, much less being able to get to them, to get more supplies to them, or to even get them out. And I think that's one of the more common rescue situations where someone's boating or rafting on a river or in a canoe and it tumps over into the water. They lose their provisions. They might even lose their mode of transportation or their paddles, and now they're stranded. They make it to land, but they're wet. They don't have all of their gear anymore, or they may not be able to find it, or their canoe may have gone way down the river or sank. And they might be able to get out on their own if they're given some additional provisions, but it just depends on where they are.
Yeah, I have a heart for adventure, but there are some things that I'm like, that maybe not to that level of like rafting down a river in the remote Alaska wilderness, but I applaud those that do.
Yeah, there
Maybe
are
one day.
guided
Who knows?
trips
I'm
where
not counting it out.
professional guides can take people out so that there's a knowledgeable person there that can help. So there are options.
Yeah, that I'm intrigued by. So we'll see. Who knows? Maybe I'll catch myself up in northern Alaska sometime soon. Well, I know we've kind of gone all over the place and gotten to talk about your past and what led you to where you are today, and just give some insight into the Gates of the Arctic in general and the types of, it sounds like the types of things that you're managing because of the remoteness of the park are unique. And so it's been cool to hear about that and hear about your perspective. A way I like to finish things off is by asking, what is something you wish everyone knew about Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve?
Well, that's an easy one for me. I think really what I would tell people is know that the park exists, know that it's there. Because, I grew up in the lower 48. I worked for the National Park Service for many years and worked in a lot of different parks. And I had heard of Gates of the Arctic. But to me, it was this place that's in northern Alaska. I really didn't know much about it. And I kind of pictured this, white frozen place. But to actually go there and see it and experience it was breathtaking, Maddie. It really was. It's hard to even describe how beautiful the park is and how big it is. So even if someone, if you can't get there this year, or even if you can never get there, you can read about it and experience it in other ways, even like through this podcast. But to be able to get there, or even to northern Alaska, some of the other NPS sites throughout the state of Alaska, is a great experience. And I think Gates of the Arctic is truly unique among National Park Service sites, national parks. It is, like I said, it's breathtaking. I don't know what other words to put to it.
See you in Gates of the Arctic. Guess we got to go.
I guess the other thing I would want people to know, and I touched on this, that there are a lot of resources out there to help people learn more about it and plan. Our visitor center in Fairbanks, and our website and others, or just pick up the phone and give us a call. We'd love to share with others.
As a park, do you typically recommend different tour groups to work with if people wanted to do a rafting or a backpacking trip?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what people want to do. I think for a first visit, that could be a great way to go, because you if you have a professional guide with you, that takes some of that planning off of your shoulders and some of that worry. Yeah. And you can perhaps focus more on true enjoyment. That may come with a additional cost. And, that's one thing about Gates of the Arctic. It is hard to get to. We're one of the least visited national parks in the whole National Park Service system. And I think that just speaks to our remoteness and, the lack of roads and trails and facilities as well. But it's there, it's accessible. You can walk from the Dalton Highway across the mountains and get into the park. It's not an easy thing to do, and I would really encourage people to be very well prepared for a trek like that. But it can be done. It can be done on a much smaller budget.
But it can be done. Yeah. That's the hope, is just opening people's eyes up to kind of what goes on behind the scenes of each park, but then also to the national parks in our system, and showcasing the stories of the Yellowstones, but then also of the parks that, are like Gates of the Arctic, like so remote and so maybe just different than what we think of a national park. There's not going to be traffic lines waiting to get in and stuff like that. So definitely a unique experience. Well, thank you for your time, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for sharing your time. And I hope you get a chance to come visit Alaska, and whether it be Gates of the Arctic or any of the other Alaska NPS sites.
Yeah, so do I. Fingers crossed. Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.